Stanley's journey across Africa marked the beginning of a new era for the continent. As he travelled, King Leopold of Belgium called for a conference in Brussels, inviting representatives from all European nations to explore Africa. However, the true purpose of the conference was to divide Africa among the European powers. Within 15 years, England, France, Germany, Portugal and Belgium had claimed territories in Africa. The process began with the carving out of a state covering the newly discovered Congo. King Leopold funded the establishment of stations along the river, but Stanley found that a Portuguese man in the service of France had already claimed the important river mouth. Portugal also claimed possession of the Congo mouth, leading to international rivalries. It became clear that an international arrangement was necessary to establish a state in the Congo. Around the same time, Germany began colonizing Africa. Claims were made in southwest Africa, the Cameroons and Zanzibar, conflicting with English interests. A congress was held in Berlin in 1884–85 to determine the rules for partitioning Africa. The principle of effective occupation was established, sweeping away Portugal's historic claims to the coast of Africa. This principle would shape the course of African history, following the good old border rule. Immediately following the Berlin Congress, and even during it, England and Germany made arrangements to settle their respective claims in southwest Africa. A similar process was undertaken to determine the limits of their spheres of influence in East Africa. The British East Africa Association, a chartered company, was established to administer the land north of Victoria Nyanza, bordered on the west by the Congo Free State and extending north to the revolted provinces of Egypt. In South Africa, a similar chartered company, under the influence of Mr. Cecil Rhodes, practically controlled the entire country from Cape Colony up to German East Africa and the Congo Free State. The winter of 1890 to 1891 saw numerous agreements of demarcation. After some friction due to Major Serpa Pinto's encroachments, the limits of Portuguese Angola on the west coast were determined, bordered on the east by the Congo Free State and British Central Africa. At the same time, Portuguese East Africa was settled in relation to British Central Africa on the west, and German East Africa on the north. Italy also made claims for a share in the eastern horn of Africa, including Abyssinia, but had to abandon them due to the unexpected strength of the Abyssinians. In 1890, agreements between Germany and England settled the line of demarcation between the Cameroons and Togoland, along with adjoining British territories. In August of the same year, an attempt was made to limit the French's excessive claims along the Niger and as far as Lake Chad. The Royal Niger Company represented British interests, but the delimitation was not very clear, leading to friction that persists to this day. The demarcation between England and France in Africa remains uncertain in the western and central portions of the continent. To the northeast, the issue of defining borders was made more complex by political events, which ultimately led to another great exploration expedition by Mr. Stanley. Egypt's expansion into the equatorial provinces under Ismail Pasha, largely due to the geographical discoveries of Grant, Speke, and Baker, led to a massive accumulation of debt. This caused the country to become bankrupt, Ismail Pasha to be removed from power, and Egypt to be jointly administered by France and England on behalf of European bondholders. This caused much dissatisfaction among Egyptian officials and army officers, who were replaced by French and English officials, leading to a rebellion under Arabi Pasha. England intervened militarily when France refused to cooperate, and British troops occupied Egypt. The Sudan and equatorial provinces had also revolted independently under Muslim fanaticism, and it was decided to relinquish those Egyptian possessions that had initially led to bankruptcy. General Gordon was sent to relieve various Egyptian garrisons in the south, but ultimately failed due to a lack of support, and was killed in 1885. One of Gordon's lieutenants, a German named Schnitzler, who had converted to Islam and was known as Emin Pasha, was left isolated in the heart of Africa near the Albert Nyanza, and Mr. Stanley was commissioned to attempt his rescue in 1887. He began marching through the Congo state, and succeeded in crossing a vast expanse of forested land inhabited by small natives who likely represented the pygmies of ancient times. He managed to reach Emin Pasha, and, after much persuasion, convinced him to accompany him to Zanzibar, only for Emin Pasha to return as a German agent to the Albert Nyanza. Mr. Stanley's journey on this occasion had political implications, since he made arrangements during the eastern part of his journey to secure British influence over the lands later handed over to the British East Africa Company. All of these political border issues were naturally accompanied by explorations, partly scientific but mainly political. Major Serpa Pinto twice crossed Africa in an attempt to connect the Portuguese settlements on the two coasts. Similarly, Lieutenant Wisman also crossed Africa twice between 1881 and 1887 in the interests of the Congo state, though he ultimately became an official of his native country, Germany. Captain Lugard, a brave explorer, ventured into the region nestled between the three Great Lakes, Nyanza, and secured it for the glory of Great Britain. Meanwhile, in South Africa, the British were making successful advances into Bechuanaland, Mashonaland, and Matabeleland. Under the brilliant leadership of Mr. Cecil Rhodes, a railway and telegraph were rapidly constructed towards the north. Thanks to the ambitious endeavours of Mr. Johnston, who eventually became Sir Henry Hamilton, the British possessions were extended as far as Nyasaland by 1891. By that time, various treaties with Germany and Portugal had definitively marked the boundaries of the different possessions of the three countries in South Africa. By 1891, the interior of Africa, which had been virtually unknown before 1880, could be mapped out with almost as much precision as South America. Europe had taken hold of Africa. In the past, exploration and conquest have gone hand in hand, or followed closely one after the other. However, there has been a third motive that has often led to interesting discoveries, followed by annexation. The mighty hunters of Africa have often brought back not only ivory and skins, but also fascinating information about the interior. The magnificent stories of Gordon Cumming in the 1850s were one of the causes that led to an interest in African exploration. Many a young man has had his imagination ignited and his career determined by the exploits of Gordon Cumming, which are now, however, almost forgotten. Mr. F.C. Selous surpassed even Gordon Cumming's achievements and has also done excellent work as a guide for successive expeditions into South Africa. The interior of Africa, where geographers once placed elephants instead of towns, become known in its main outlines by a successive series of intrepid explorers who often had to be warriors as well as scientific men. Whatever the motives the white man had that led him into the center of the dark continent, love of adventure, scientific curiosity, big game, or patriotism resulted in the continent becoming known instead of merely its coastline. On the whole, it was through the explorations of the English that knowledge of the interior of Africa was obtained, and England was richly rewarded by gaining control over the most promising parts of the continent at the time, the Nile Valley and temperate South Africa. France likewise gained possession of almost the entire northwest Africa. Caravan routes tapped the basin of the Niger and conducted its products to Algeria, which was then a colony of France. Chapter 12. The North and South Poles. The explorations we have recounted thus far were motivated by practical purposes, such as reaching the Spice Islands or hunting big game. Even the expeditions of Davis, Frobisher, Hudson, and Baffin in pursuit of the Northwest Passage, and of Barentz and Chancellor in search of the Northeast Passage, were driven by mercantile goals. Only with James Cook did the era of purely scientific exploration begin, although it is worth noting that the Russian expedition under Bering, which we mentioned earlier, was ordered by Peter the Great to determine a strictly geographical problem, even if it had implications for Russian ambitions. Bering and Cook together solved the problem of the relationship between the ends of Asia and America, but what remained to the north of terra firma within the Arctic Circle. That was the problem that the 19th century set out to solve, and it has come very close to doing so. We now have maps of the Arctic Circle that show only a few thousand square miles of blank space. This knowledge was gained through slow and arduous means, requiring heroic courage and endurance. It is a heroic tale, in which love of adventure and zeal for science overcame the horrors of an Arctic winter, 6 months of darkness in silence and desolation, extreme cold, and the danger of starvation. It is impossible to delve into the details that make the story of Arctic voyages one of the most stirring in human history. Our concern is solely with the amount of new knowledge brought back by successive expeditions within the Arctic Circle. This region of the Earth's surface is characterized by several large islands in the eastern hemisphere, most of which were discovered early on. As we have seen, the Norsemen landed and settled on Greenland as early as the 10th century. Burroughs sighted Nova Zembla in 1556 during one of the voyages in search of the Northeast Passage, although the very name, Russian for Newfoundland, implies that it had previously been sighted and named by Russian seamen. In the Arctic Circle, Barents is credited with being the first to lay eyes on Spitzbergen. The vast collection of islands to the north of Siberia was discovered through the Russian explorations of Dishkanev, Bering, and their followers. Meanwhile, the intricate network of islands to the north of North America was slowly mapped during the search for the Northwest Passage. This elusive goal was the driving force behind most of the discoveries in the Arctic Circle, and it gave a general impetus to Arctic exploration. The modern history of Arctic exploration began with a renewed effort to find the Northwest Passage. In 1818, 2 expeditions were sent out under the influence of Sir Joseph Banks to search for the passage and attempt to reach the pole. John Ross in the Isabella and Wee Parry in the Alexander were tasked with finding the passage, while John Franklin sailed in the Trent to explore the polar region. Unfortunately, both expeditions were unsuccessful, though Ross and Parry confirmed the discoveries of Baffin. Despite this setback, 2 more expeditions were sent out 2 years later to attempt the Northwest Passage. One was led by Franklin on land and the other by Parry at sea. Parry managed to cross half of North America, discovered the archipelago that now bears his name, and reached 114 degrees west longitude, earning the prize of £5,000 given by the British Parliament for the first seaman to sail west of the 110th meridian. However, he was stopped by Banks Land, and the strait that would have allowed him to complete the Northwest Passage was closed by ice at that time. In 2 successive voyages in 1822 and 1824, Parry increased the detailed knowledge of the coasts he had already discovered, but failed to reach as far westward as he had on his first voyage. This somewhat discouraged government attempts at exploration, and the next expedition in 1829 was funded by Mr. Felix Booth, Sheriff of London, who dispatched the paddle steamer Victory, commanded by John Ross. Ross discovered the land now known as Boothia Felix, and his nephew James C. Ross proved that it belonged to the mainland of America, which he coasted along by land to Cape Franklin. He also determined the exact position of the North Magnetic Pole at Cape Adelaide on Boothia Felix. After spending 5 years within the Arctic Circle, Ross and his companions, who had been forced to abandon the Victory, were rescued by a whaler and brought home. We must now turn our attention back to Franklin, who had been sent by the Admiralty to map the northern coast of America. At the time of his departure, only 2 points had been determined, the Coppermine and the Mackenzie, discovered by Hearne and Mackenzie, respectively. It wasn't until 1821 that Franklin was able to set out from the mouth of the Coppermine, travelling eastward in 2 canoes, coasting along until he reached Point Turnagain. By then, they only had 3 days' worth of pemmican left, and they were forced to subsist on lichens and scraps of roasted leather to make it back to Fort Enterprise. 4 years later, in 1825, Franklin embarked on another expedition with the same objective, this time starting from the mouth of the Mackenzie River. He dispatched one of his companions, Richardson, to connect the coast between the Mackenzie and the Coppermine, while he himself travelled westward to meet the Blossom, under Captain Beechey, which had been sent to Bering Strait to bring his party back. Richardson was entirely successful in examining the coastline between the Mackenzie and the Coppermine, but Beechey, while he managed to round Icy Cape and trace the coast as far as Point Barrow, did not catch up to Franklin, who had only reached 160 miles at Return Reef. These 160 miles, as well as the 222 miles between Cape Turnagain, Franklin's easternmost point by land, and Cape Franklin, J.C. Ross's most westerly point, were later filled in by T. Simpson in 1837. Simpson accomplished this after a coasting voyage in boats of 1408 miles, which remains a record to this day. Meanwhile, in 1833, C.J. Back discovered the Great Fish River and followed it to its mouth. During the voyage down the river, an oar broke while the boat was shooting a rapid, and one of the party began praying loudly. The leader called out, "Is this a time for praying? Pull your starboard oar!" Meanwhile, the South Pole had captured the imagination of many, including those searching for the fabled Australian continent that supposedly surrounded it. Captain Cook had ventured as far south as 71.10 degrees, but was halted by the Great Ice Barrier. From 1820 to 1823, Weddell explored the South Shetlands, south of Cape Horn, and discovered an active volcano despite the extreme cold. He reached 74 degrees, but found no land in the area. Bellany discovered the islands that bear his name in 1839, including a 12,000-foot-high volcano and another that was still active on Buckle Island. In the same year, a French expedition led by Dumont d'Urville explored the South Shetlands, and the following year, Captain Wilkes of the United States Navy discovered land that now bears his name. However, the most significant discovery in Antarctica was made by Sir J.C. Ross, who had been sent by the Admiralty in 1840 to locate the South Magnetic Pole. With the ships Erebus and Terror, he discovered Victoria Land and 2 active volcanoes that he named after his ships, which were pouring forth flaming lava amidst the snow. In January 1842, Ross reached the farthest south point at 76 degrees. Since then, little has been attempted in the south, except for Borchgrevink's visit to Victoria Land in the winter of 1894 to 1895. After the Erebus and Terror returned from the South Seas, the government made them available to Franklin, who had been knighted for his previous discoveries. On May the 26th, 1845, Franklin set out with 129 people on board the 2 vessels, which were provisioned up to July 1848. They were last seen by a whaler on July 26, 1845, waiting to pass into Lancaster Sound. After reaching as far north as 77 degrees through Wellington Channel, Franklin was forced to winter on Beechey Island. In September 1846, his 2 ships were beset in Victoria Strait, about 12 miles from King William Land. It is a curious fact that in the year 1847, J. Ray was dispatched by land from Cape Repulse in Hudson's Bay. He journeyed along the east coast of Boothia, thereby connecting the coast journeys of Ross and Franklin with Hudson's Bay. On the 18th of April in that same year, Ray arrived at a point on Boothia that was less than 150 miles from Franklin on the other side. Less than 2 months later, on June the 11th, Franklin passed away on the Erebus. His ships were only provisioned until July 1848, and remained beset throughout the entirety of 1847. Crozier, who took command after Franklin's death, left the ship with 105 survivors in an attempt to reach Back's Fish River. They struggled along the west coast of King William Land, but failed to reach their destination. Disease and starvation gradually reduced their numbers. An old Eskimo woman who had watched the melancholy procession later told McClintock that the men fell down and died as they walked. By this time, considerable anxiety had been aroused by the absence of any news from Franklin's party. Richardson and Ray were dispatched by land in 1848, while 2 ships were sent on the attempt to reach Franklin through Bering Strait, and 2 others, the Investigator and the Enterprise, under J.C. Ross, through Baffin Bay. Ray reached the east coast of Victoria Land and arrived within 50 miles of the spot where Franklin's 2 ships had been abandoned. However, it was not until his second expedition by land, which began in 1853, that he obtained any news. After wintering at Lady Pelly Bay, on April the 20th, 1854, Ray met a young Eskimo who told him that 4 years previously, 40 white men had been seen dragging a boat to the south on the west shore of King William Land. A few months later, the bodies of 30 of these men had been found by the Eskimo, who produced silver with the Franklin crest to confirm the truth of their statement. Further searches by land were continued up to as late as 1879, when Lieutenant F. Schwatka of the United States Army discovered several of the graves and skeletons of the Franklin expedition. In 1848, 2 attempts to find news of Franklin's expedition by sea from the Atlantic or Pacific base failed. In 1850, the Enterprise and the Investigator, which had previously tried to reach Franklin from the east, were sent to search from the west through Bering Strait under Captain R. Collinson and Captain McClure. McClure, in the Investigator, did not wait for Collinson as directed, but pushed on and discovered Banks Land. He became trapped in the ice in Prince of Wales Strait, and unsuccessfully tried to work his way from this strait into Parry Sound in the winter of 1850 to 1851. However, in August and September 1851, he managed to coast around Banks Land to its most northwesterly point, and then passed through the strait named after him, reaching Barrow Strait. This was the first time the Northwest Passage was completed, although the Investigator was abandoned in 1853. Collinson, in the Enterprise, followed McClure closely, but never reached him. He attempted to round Prince Albert Land by the south through Dolphin Strait, and reached Cambridge Bay at the nearest point by ship of all the Franklin expeditions. He had to return westward, and only reached England in 1855, after an absence of 5 years and 4 months. From the east, 10 vessels attempted the Franklin Sea Search in 1851, including 2 Admiralty expeditions, 1 private English one, an American combined government and private party, and a ship put in commission by Lady Franklin. They all tried to search Lancaster Sound, where Franklin had last been seen, but only found 3 graves of men who had died at an early stage and were buried on Beechey Island. Another set of 4 vessels was dispatched under Sir Edward Belcher in 1852, which was lucky enough to reach McClure in the Investigator the following year, enabling him to complete the Northwest Passage. He gained the reward of £10,000 offered by Parliament in 1763 for this achievement. However, Belcher had to abandon most of his vessels, one of which, the Resolute, drifted over 1,000 miles. It was recovered by an American whaler, refitted by the United States, and presented to the Queen and people of Great Britain. Notwithstanding all these efforts, the remains of Franklin's expedition have yet to be discovered. However, Lady Franklin was not satisfied with this vague information. She was determined to fit out still another expedition, though already over $35,000 had been spent by private means, mostly from her own personal fortune. In 1857, the steam yacht Fox was dispatched under McClintock, who had already shown himself the most capable master of sledge work. He erected a monument to the Franklin expedition on Beechey Island in 1858, and then, following Peel Sound, he made inquiries of the natives throughout the winter of 1858 to 1859. This led him to search King William Land, where, on May the 25th, he came across a bleached human skeleton lying on its face, showing that the man had died as he walked. Meanwhile, Hobson, one of his companions, discovered a record of the Franklin expedition, stating briefly its history between 1845 and 1848. With this definite information about the fate of the Franklin expedition, McClintock returned to England in 1859, having succeeded in solving the problem of Franklin's fate while exploring over 800 miles of coastline in the neighborhood of King William Land. The result of the various Franklin expeditions had thus been to map out the intricate network of islands dotted over the north of North America. None of these, however, reached much farther north than 75 degrees. Only Smith Sound promised to lead north of the 80th parallel. This had been discovered as early as 1616 by Baffin, whose farthest north was only exceeded by 40 miles, in 1852, by Inglefield in the Isabel, one of the ships dispatched in search of Franklin. He was followed up by Kane in the Advance, fitted out in 1853 by the munificence of 2 American citizens, Grinnell and Peabody. Kane worked his way right through Smith Sound and Robeson Channel into the sea named after him. For 2 years he continued investigating Grinnell Land and the adjacent shores of Greenland. Subsequent investigations by Hayes in 1860 and Hall 10 years later kept alive the interest in Smith Sound and its neighborhood. In 1873, 3 ships were dispatched under Captain, afterwards Sir George Nares, who nearly completed the survey of Grinnell Land, and one of his lieutenants, Pelham Aldrich, succeeded in reaching 82.48 degrees north. At about the same time, an Austrian expedition under Payer and Weiprecht explored the highest-known land, much to the east, named by them Franz Joseph Land, after the Austrian emperor. In the late 1800s, interest in the northern regions was piqued by Professor Nordenskiold's successful navigation of the Northeast Passage. He had ventured into Arctic regions on 7 or 8 voyages between 1858 and 1870, and was later bestowed with the title of Baron. In 1875 to 1876, he made 2 journeys that established the possibility of travelling from Norway to the mouth of the Yenisei River in the summer. Captain Wiggins followed in his footsteps for commercial purposes, frequently passing from England to the Yenisei River in a merchant vessel. As Siberia developed, it was clear that this route would become increasingly important for commerce. Professor Nordenskiold, encouraged by his easy passage to the Yenisei River, decided to attempt to round Bering Strait from that point. In 1878, he set out on the Vega, accompanied by the Lena and a collier to supply them with coal. On August the 19th, they passed Cape Chelyuskin, which is the most northerly point of the Old World. From there the Lena turned towards the mouth of its namesake river, while the Vega continued on its course. On September the 12th, the Vega reached Cape North, which is within 120 miles of Bering Strait. This was the same cape that Captain Cook had reached from the east in 1778. Unfortunately, the ice became packed so tightly that they could not proceed any further, and they were forced to remain in this frustrating condition for 10 months. On July the 18th, 1879, the ice finally broke up, and 2 days later, the Vega rounded East Cape with flying colours, saluting the easternmost coast of Asia in honour of the completion of the Northeast Passage. Baron Nordenskiold has since enjoyed a well-earned rest from his arduous labours in the north by studying and publishing the history of early cartography. He has issued 2 valuable atlases containing facsimiles of the maps and charts from the Middle Ages. General interest in Arctic exploration was rekindled, leading to a united effort by all civilized nations to investigate the conditions of the polar regions. In 1879, an international polar conference convened in Hamburg, where it was decided to surround the North Pole with scientific observation stations for the years 1882 to 83. The goal was to study the conditions of the polar ocean. 15 expeditions were dispatched, with some heading to the Antarctic regions, but most of them focused on the North Pole. The primary objective was to serve the interest of physical geography rather than geographical discovery. However, the United States expedition, led by Lieutenant A.W. Greely, resumed the study of Smith Sound and its outlets. One of his men, Lieutenant Lockwood, made it to 83.24 degrees north, which was the farthest north any human had ever reached, and within 450 miles of the pole. The Greely expedition also demonstrated that Greenland was not entirely ice-capped, but rather ice-surrounded. Until then, the universal method of making discoveries in the polar regions was to establish a base with sufficient food and push in any required direction as far as possible, leaving successive caches to be returned to when provisions fell short on the forward journey. However, in 1888, Dr. Fridtjof Nansen decided on a bolder method of investigating the interior of Greenland. He was dropped off on the east coast, where there were no inhabitants, and began crossing Greenland. His life depended on the success of his journey, as he left no reserves in the rear, and it would be pointless to return. He succeeded brilliantly in his attempt, and his exploit was followed up by 2 successive attempts by Lieutenant Peary in 1892 to 95. Peary managed to cross Greenland at a much higher latitude than Nansen. Dr. Nansen, emboldened by the success of his previous plan, set his sights on an even more daring endeavour. Through the international polar observations of 1882 to 83, he became convinced that the ice in the Arctic Ocean drifted continuously from the northeast shore of Siberia. This belief was further reinforced by the discovery of debris from the Jeannette, a ship abandoned off the Siberian coast in 1881, which had drifted to the east coast of Greenland by 1884. With this knowledge, he commissioned the construction of the Fram, a vessel specifically designed to withstand the pressure of the ice. Previous Arctic explorations had focused on avoiding being trapped in the ice and attempting to navigate around land shores. However, Dr. Nansen believed that he could achieve his goals by boldly disregarding these conventions and relying on the ice drift to carry him closer to the pole. He estimated that the journey would take approximately 3 years and provisioned the Fram for 5. Despite facing criticism from many quarters, Dr. Nansen's bold plan proved successful. The ice drift carried him across the polar sea within the 3-year time frame he had predicted. However, he realized that the drift would not take him far enough north, so he and a companion left the Fram and headed straight for the pole. In April 1895, they reached 86.14 degrees, coming within 200 miles of their goal. On the return journey, Dr. Nansen was fortunate enough to encounter Mr. F. Jackson, who had established himself in Franz Josef Land in 1894 aboard the Windward. The meeting of these 2 intrepid explorers serves as a fitting parallel to the celebrated encounter of Stanley and Livingstone, albeit under entirely different climatic conditions. And with this meeting, the final chapters of geographical discovery were slowly and deliberately written. With the polar regions documented, there are simply very few spaces on the maps that are blank. And with aerial map-making, satellite cartography, and deep-penetrating radar, the new secrets are the ones buried, opening a whole new world for modern discoverers to explore. The end. This concludes Edge of the Earth, written by Doug Richardson, narrated by R.K. Marks. Visit brooksaudiobooks.com for updates on the availability of new books and a special free offer.